Welcome, everybody. Great to have you back for another episode of The Sunday Shot. Great pleasure to be with you, and a great pleasure to, again, welcome my co-host this morning, Dave Milner. Dave, welcome.
Morning, Joe. Morning, everybody.
We are thrilled to be here. I am beaming in from the unceded lands of the mighty Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. But we're thrilled. Also coming in from Gadigal land is the CEO of Cheek Media and everyone's favourite Gen Z commentator, Hannah Ferguson.
Thank you so much for having me. That's a great title. I'll take that.
Welcome. Our first outing with the Sunday Shot. It's thrilling to have you. And also joining us is Mark Lawyer's Michael Bradley, who I don't know, you're coming in from maybe Cammeray land over there on the North Shore, Michael. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, Cammeray land. Yep.
Beautiful. Look, it's been a busy week again, as ever. This week we saw what I didn't think was ever going to happen, and that was a big backflip from Creative Australia to reinstate Khaled Sabsabi and his curator, Michael D'Agostino, as our representatives at the Venice Biennale, the so-called Oscars of the visual arts world. Now, this has been a huge scandal in the arts industry. The fact that Creative Australia essentially sacked them in a frenzied moral panic because of, yet again, News Corp agitating to make trouble and cultural warriors in the Senate. Michael, Khaled is actually a client of yours, joining a little cohort of clients who have been the victims of the hysteria which has swept through the country in the wake of the terrible massacres of October 7, where it seems that anything ambiguous in relation to the Middle East, and particularly coming from a Palestinian or indeed even Lebanese kind of perspective, is going to be viewed with great suspicion.
Yeah. I would describe it as a frenzy. Khaled's case was particularly insane, given just the circumstances. It wasn't a Twitter post that they were upset about. It was artwork from a long time ago. It's all on the public record. It's been on public display for a long time, and it was literally one question in the Senate, an Australian article, a phone call from the minister, and then suddenly we didn't have a representative to the Biennale, and then months of rubbish until they finally did what they should have done. And the only other thing they now need to do is all resign.
Well, indeed, because at the moment, no one has been held accountable. It just seems that there was all sorts of missteps that were taken along the way. There was a failure of risk management after the fact. But in the report which has been released by Blackhall and Pearl, which is very much focused on governance as opposed to poor judgment, it seems everybody and nobody can be held responsible for, really the biggest crisis that Creative Australia has faced since it became Creative Australia.
Yeah, I think, we could have a very long conversation about the notion of corporate irresponsibility. But, I think what's troubling about the report and that approach is both this sort of complete absence of application of responsibility to anyone. It seems to have sort of happened by accident, but also a really intense focus on what they call risk management, where they go on and on and on about how Creative Australia should have been aware that appointing Khaled was going to be incredibly controversial and they should have been ready for that, which is just a signal to everyone, don't appoint someone like Khaled Sabsabi. And that's really bad.
What I'm going to do just quickly is just show our viewers the offending artwork. So there were two artworks that were deemed to be controversial, and that apparently the existence of these old artworks was going to undermine the social license of Creative Australia to exist at all, according to the CEO, Adrian Collette. Now, one of them, which featured Hezbollah leader, former Hezbollah leader Nasralli, that was basically known about, and so people thought, oh, we can probably manage this. But there was one which was apparently only discovered when it was, despite having existed, as Michael says, for decades, when it was named in Parliament by now backbencher Claire Chandler, backbencher, still cultural warrior. So let's just have a quick look at this 18-second work which caused all the controversy.
Thank you very much.
So that was it. that 18 seconds is basically what led to this entire controversy. Hannah, you're very kind of, well, I think very literate in the media. What was your take, essentially, on the way that art was being deployed as a kind of an ideological weapon in the culture wars?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that it's ridiculous that politicians have the ability to look at that and decide what it actually means and what the artist is trying to convey. And it's not about the art at all. And I think that most people watching this through the lens of specifically social media has been where a lot of sort of left-wing, the progressive, the very neutral, central kind of pragmatic approach to this has been, what are we talking about? What is this conversation? Because the only thing that I think a lot of Gen Z specifically see, and I see, is the establishment attacking an individual because they don't like the complaints they were facing because of them. Like, it just doesn't get more, I don't actually think it's that much more complex or complicated than that. And so I think that what's been frustrating to watch is that realistically lots of, established bodies are just responding to the loudest voice in the room. And, not long ago, that was, Zionists, that was lobby groups, that was Israeli lobby groups that were making one phone call, sending a few emails that were copy and paste templates and getting someone knocked out of a position. And now I think that the tide is turning and the conversation is only turning because there's been enough backlash from the public saying, this is absurd, this is ridiculous, this is blatantly unfair. But of course, like Michael's experience and what he's saying about Khaled is also applied to Antoinette Lattouf, that is the message newsrooms are getting that, they should be changing things and actually looking at the kind of rotten center that they're operating from. Instead, I think they're saying, what if we just didn't actually approach diversity differently at all and we didn't hire in diverse settings and actually consider DEI policies or apply them whatsoever? So the message and the result of this is almost far worse in that this means a completely different thing for our landscape. I was lucky enough recently to go to an Amnesty International dinner where Noor Haider, Jan Fran and Antoinette Lattouf spoke about the current state of Australian newsrooms. And one of the key things they were saying is that lived experience is seen as a liability if you're Lebanese, if you're Muslim, if you're from these backgrounds, if you're Palestinian, but it's seen as an asset. It's seen as a privilege and an advantage in newsrooms if you've been on a trip to Israel that was paid for by someone else. So I think the way this is being treated is completely disgusting, but it is this thing of, journalism is about removing the people at the heart of these stories with relation and proximity. It's about actually using that analysis for the benefit of the entire team, and that's not what's being doing. They're being silenced.
I mean, there is that case, it is the case, Michael, that in the report by Blackhall and Pearl for Creative Australia, they do try and make it clear that when they're talking about risk management, they don't necessarily mean risk aversion, that, art always should carry danger and risk, or can always carry danger and risk. But is that the message that you think is being received more broadly by these institutions and organisations?
No, I don't. I think, nobody's going to read the report.
I read the report.
Yeah, I did too, but, we're not normal people.
I read the report.
I do, like I'm seeing constantly people who are, who are going through these experiences where they're being targeted and then cancelled in lots of different ways. and effectively silenced. The concerning thing is, to me, is the cases that are never happening in the first place because the artist is not being given the award, the journalist is not being hired, the academic is not getting the job, because the institution is seeing all of this play out, and in an environment where the media and political institutions are all just pandering to the Israel lobby and are all still scared of the Australian. And so, the line of least resistance is just don't get into that in the first place and just hire white people. And so I'm absolutely sure that there is an enormous silencing going on by default. And it's going to take a long time to come back from that.
And
Yeah.
I think the overall big picture here, which we should talk about a little bit, is media quite clearly captured by a white Western establishment at the moment. I mean, so much of the journalism I do is driven by a sense of rage and despair at what this profession has become. We can see law being weaponized in various ways to allow this fascist onslaught to come at us. And one of the most effective barriers to this across human civilization is art. It's how we understand these cycles that are ever present. It's how we understand the human condition. I learn more from Star Wars than I do from switching on the ABC News about this stuff. So that's why this sort of silencing of art isn't just a thing for bourgeois fuckos to be upset about. This is something for all of us to be quite concerned about.
Yeah. I mean, one of the
And
interesting
we're not
things...
bourgeois fuckos. I shouldn't use that phrase. So it's early, Sunday morning.
Don't speak for yourself.
One of the interesting things, I think, is that, and I guess it goes to the point of whether or not there is at least now a bit of a turning of the tide that we've seen, is that there was a case that was handed down today this week rather, in Victoria on Wertheim v. Haddad, which was the case of a preacher who was delivering lectures that were incredibly racist and that were online. And so rightly, he's been held to account for them and they have to be taken offline. But in the course of the judgment from Justice Stewart, he was very clear that there were elements of these lectures that Haddad had delivered which were in breach of the Racial Discrimination Act. But there were some which were more criticisms of Israel and the IDF, which were not. And he was saying political criticism of Israel, however inflammatory or adversarial, is not by its nature criticism of Jews in general or based on Jewish racial or ethnic identity. The conclusion that it is not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel is the corollary of the conclusion that to blame Jews for the actions of Israel is anti-Semitic. The one flows from the other. So do you think both here and in the case of Latouche v. the ABC, Michael, that the courts are now helping us to turn the tide on accusations of anti-Semitism, which are being thrown around with wild abandon for what are really criticisms of Israel?
Yeah, definitely. It's really heartening, those two federal court decisions. The other thing that Justice Stewart said in the same passage in the Wertheim case was he called out Zionism as what he describes it as a philosophy or ideology, and he separated it from Jewishness explicitly in the same way that he separated criticism of Israel from criticism from anti-Semitism. That's an incredibly important point, because the conflation of Zionism with Jewishness is at the heart of a lot of the disputes that are going on. I've got another case in the federal court that's just been launched, which is also an 18C case against a couple of academics, and that is that specific idea that if you Zionism or Zionist is used as code for Jew routinely, and that anytime anyone says anything anti-Zionist, they are actually being anti-Semitic undercover. That's
and
at
this
the heart
is a definition that some of the universities have adopted, coming out, or definition based on the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and it
Yeah,
has
so
been
like
controversial.
I was reading a letter that one of the universities wrote to an academic just recently, where they didn't just take that controversial IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, they then actually even added extra words into it that aren't even there to to sort of drive home this conflation and say, look, because this guy's been saying bad things about Zionists. They said, well, that is by definition anti-Semitic. So kind of the fact that a couple of judges have now stood up and seen straight through the sort of intellectual sophistry that's been going on and just called out this is what's actually happening here. Probably even more so in the Latouche case, where the judge was very explicit about what was going on. This was a campaign by a lobby group, and it had a specific intent, and it started the minute Antoinette went on air. And so it wasn't, as he said, it wasn't what she had done they were objecting to, it was her.
Yeah.
Michael, these rulings, what sort of protection do they give the rest of us? Like, if my next headline was something like, court rules it's not anti-Semitic to say Israel is a baby-murdering, Nazified, genocidal, fascist shithole, do I have some sort of legal protection to say that's definitely anti-Zionism, not anti-Semitism?
Pretty sure the court did not say that.
Putting it in my words, my colourful words.
It's of course it's fraught territory because on the fringes of the pro-Palestine movement is some anti-Semitism.
Absolutely.
Some people do use Zionist as a synonym for Jew. It's a fine line in some cases.
And we did see some awful kind of anti-Semitic attacks in the heart of Melbourne on Friday, the attack on the shul, and indeed even the protesters kind of terrorising some diners at an Israeli restaurant. So yes, there is
let's provide the
anti-Semitism
context
happening.
for that, though. That Israeli restaurant is owned by the man that is the face of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation,
it is part
massacring
owned by
people
him.
at food aid distribution sites. I think it's a perfectly legitimate site for a protest.
Well, talking about protests, there are all sorts of protests that's going on. Hannah, it was really interesting to see, again, this kind of moral panic meets frenzy around this time, what some feral musicians were doing on the stages of Glastonbury. And now police are investigating both Kneecap and Bob Vylan, which I have to say was not a duo that I had heard of before this. Kneecap I was familiar with, for now kind of potential public offence crimes for calling out the IDF and Israel. Admittedly, it has to be said in kind of quite strident terms. Death to the IDF, I think, was Bob Vylan's mantra from the stage. But they are now being investigated by police. And there's all sorts of contretemps going on between the government and the BBC for the BBC daring to continue to stream this. Where are we at when musos are now being called out and there's more focus on what musicians are saying on the stages of Glastonbury than actually what's going on in Gaza?
It was really interesting after all this kind of emerged last week that I had a few different calls from journalists who wanted quotes from me about my thoughts on influencers getting involved in politics. And it's just this regurgitation of the same thing. I'm like, okay, I don't think a musician's an influencer, but I also think what we're forgetting is that musicians staging protests and using their platform for this kind of an opportunity isn't a new Gen Z weird thing. And it's so funny to watch politicians like Keir Starmer be so upset by this when it's like, what was the music of your childhood communicating to you? Like, so much of the thing that Batuta did a great post about, like him claiming to be a fan of the Smiths or something I saw last week too, where I'm like, I think a lot of boomers and Gen X politicians specifically are sort of telling the kids to get out of politics. It's like, isn't this the perfect platform to speak to these issues just historically like it has been? Like, if anything, we're reclaiming this moment and using it just for a new subject matter. So it's really strange to be called with like these how dare they sort of claims when I constantly say social media is just a new opportunity to spread a message that the mainstream media refuses to. And yes, sometimes that is for poor reasons and it's done in poor ways. And sometimes it is disinformation or misinformation. But in this case, it's people using a platform and wielding it, I think, to project their political views. And, you know, it's the same sort of criticism and for different reasons that Greta Thunberg was met with. You know, you're headline grabbing, you're attention seeking. No, we're redirecting. You're trying to get Murdoch to actually pay attention to this in one way or another. And whether that's self-serving is not really the question at all. And I think it's quite interesting then to watch the politicians respond, to watch the public respond. And, you know, again, the death, the IDF sort of chant. Initially, I found it jarring, of course, but then you have to think about the fact that that is whether, you know, no matter how you see that, at a certain point you need to recognise the harm that the IDF has caused. And death, that organisation, I don't think is particularly that controversial as a claim. I understand the way it's been perceived and that maybe it could have been done slightly differently. But I think, you know, as far as Gen Z go, this is an opportunity to see and reclaim that opportunity to have people that we look up to in different ways actually taking political stances publicly. In saying that, I think that looking at the UK's response, particularly to this festival and the way they've attacked the BBC, it's just another sign of the way lobby groups become the loudest, most powerful voice in the room. But I think that this has got the conversation going again and it's done what it intended to do.
I mean, I think the kind of incredible thing about it is that apparently musicians on the stages of Glastonbury, that's a bridge too far for protest and legitimate protest. And then actually when you see people taking to the streets and protesting, then that too is now in the process of becoming sort of criminalised. I mean, I didn't see overnight, Dave, but you were looking at 83-year-old preachers being thrown down and arrested over in the UK for protesting against Gaza.
Obviously, the UK is in and the US, slightly dire situations than we are presently, but let's not get complacent. But yes, the UK government has proscribed Palestine Action as a terrorist group, putting them in the same legal category as ISIS.
Yeah.
And what happened overnight was 25 peaceful, silent vigil protesters were arrested by UK police, including an 83-year-old pacifist. And in solidarity, Roger Waters put out a statement saying, I also support Palestine Action, come and arrest me. We are very much at a this is I'm Spartacus moment, basically, is what's happening. And, you know, as we all know, this is really quite alarming stuff. It's not too unusual because protesting is always demonized. I used to skip high school to go to protests and, you know, I've been doing this for 25 years.
So rock and roll, Dave.
But for 25 years, I've gone to events on the streets where 100,000 people have been chanting for the end of this or the end of that. And then you get home that night and the footage is of the 3 people that found a plastic bin and rolled it down a street trickling towards a cop car.
Yeah.
Always distort these things.
Well, I think we have seen, as I say, in recent times, a real focus on protest and seeking to criminalise that, and new laws being enacted seemingly on a daily basis to try and inhibit democratic rights to protest. We're going to go to a short package about the events that took place with former Greens candidate Hannah Thomas this week, and then an interview with Violet CoCo, who is a frontline activist who has, she told me, been arrested over 40 times. So we'll have a look at that, and then we're going to come back and just really get into a bit more what is going on in the various states and the potential risk to democratic rights to protest, particularly as a vehicle for change in these sort of fraught times.
This week saw a violent scuffle break out between pro-Palestine protesters and the police that resulted in former Greens candidate for the federal seat of Grayndler and daughter of former Malaysian Attorney General Hannah Thomas being hospitalised and having to undergo eye surgery. She puts both the behaviour of the police and the attitude of the New South Wales government towards protesters squarely in the frame.
I don't want to get into too much detail about the traumatic events on Friday, but I'm 5'1". I weigh about 45 kilos. I was engaged in peaceful protests, and my interactions with New South Wales police have left me potentially without vision in my right eye permanently. I look like this now because of Chris Minns and Yasmin Catley and their draconian anti-protest laws and their attempts to demonize protesters, especially protesters for Palestine. They've emboldened the police to crack down with extreme violence and brutality, and they were warned that those laws would lead to this outcome.
This is not the first time the New South Wales government has been accused of anti-protester overreach. Climate activist Violet CoCo was denied bail and jailed for 13 days of what was initially a 15-month sentence after blocking a lane of peak-hour traffic on the Harbour Bridge. Violet's sentence was later overturned, partly because the police were found to have lied to the court. The Supreme Court subsequently struck down parts of the then coalition government's laws targeting climate protests on the basis that it impermissibly burdened the implied freedom of political communication. I spoke to Violet earlier this week. Now, you were one of the first people who were actually jailed under the anti-protest laws that were enacted by the previous New South Wales government, but with the enthusiastic support of the Labor opposition. Can you tell us what happened to you?
Yeah, well, there was a series of protests, both by Blockade Australia and Fireproof Australia, trying to seek climate justice. And the anti-protest laws were rushed through Parliament. The Greens did their best to filibuster, which is like keep asking questions and talking to try and extend it out. But yeah, unfortunately, it was voted through very quickly, including by my uncle.
Yes, I saw that.
Yeah.
That made him make some awkward family dinners.
Oh, we don't get dinner. Yeah. And what we saw happen with that was it gave the courts and the police a lot more scope to repress protesters. So just before I was sentenced, there was actually another person who all they did was run onto a football pitch and disrupt the game. But because that happened, they actually got sentenced to 3 months in prison. And that was extreme overreach and it was overturned really quickly. But they weren't obviously charged with the anti-protest laws. They were charged with disrupting the peace or whatever. But what we see is that these laws give permission for the courts and the police to overreach with protesters. And that's just a blight on our democracy. Protest is such an important part of making laws that are for the people. Often frontline movements, direct action movements, they lead the way on what the people's morality is. And we're in a time where, we have climate crisis, we have a genocide going on. Here in Victoria, they only just acknowledged the genocide that happened on this continent. And so, there's a lot of reasons to be active, and these laws are only going to oppress those voices.
So when you were charged under these laws that had been enacted in New South Wales, that was because you had been on the Harbour Bridge and you had shut down one lane of traffic for half an hour. So can you tell us a little bit about what happened when you were doing the protest and then the charges and the really quite draconian sentence that was handed down on you initially?
Yeah, so we were on top of a truck. I was sharing the truck space with a firefighter. And basically, we were calling out to protect our firefighters during fire seasons. They want an aerial firefighter fleet. That's what came out of the 2019-2020 bushfire reports, is that we need an aerial firefighting fleet. Because what's happening in California, their fire seasons are extending and our fire seasons are extending, and we used to share planes. But we can't share planes anymore. And so without our own fleet, it leaves us incredibly vulnerable, because when those fires start out in the bush, you can't get a truck out there. You need a plane. So we were up there trying to protect lives. It was basically, there was 3 other lanes beside us. We really didn't cause any traffic at all. It was very much a performative act. And we chose that site because they had just done the anti-protest laws. And basically the anti-protest laws meant that if you blocked any road, you get, we're up to a $22,000 fine or up to 2 years in prison, which was already the case on the Harbour Bridge. And so it was sort of saying like, well, the deterrence was there for the Harbour Bridge, but now it's all roads. We may as well just like take this one, you know?
Yeah.
And make that statement. So after I was arrested, it was actually probably about 9 months until I was sentenced to the 15 months in prison. Between that time, I spent most of it under house arrest. So I was actually, it was like quite a punitive response. I was really unable to connect with any of my community. I had non-association conditions with all of my community, including my partner at the time.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was really, really intense. Once we were sentenced, obviously the massive outrage that followed from the people saved my life. It really did. And so I just, again, want to extend all the gratitude to all the people who organized and mobilized and all the people who wrote into me while I was in prison. That really, really helps to like keep yourself well. And it helps to make sure the prison know that, you know, like
people are watching what's happening to you. Yeah.
Yeah, because I did have the head of the prison come down and like looking in my cell like I was some kind of bird in a cage that they'd caught and that kind of stuff. And he did call me a lamb to the slaughter. And I was like, I'm not the lamb, I'm the lion. Like, so you're the lamb to the slaughter? No.
Because it was very unusual for you to have been denied bail for a peaceful protest, a non-violent crime, and yet the magistrate really chose to throw the book at you.
Absolutely. That magistrate, I mean, so it was very interesting. On the day we had a different magistrate, and then last minute they moved us to another magistrate. So we feel like there was some sort of strings being pulled. It felt very much like it was a political situation, and I was a political prisoner at the time. And had been for 8 months already in my own home.
So you were denied bail, and so then you were in jail.
I was in Silverwater Prison. Yeah.
Yeah. And that did not last that long in the end, that there was an appeal against the bail conditions that you were successful in overturning?
Yeah, so when you first apply for bail after you've been sentenced, it goes to the same magistrate that sentences you. And so that is also a really big problem with our law, because obviously if a magistrate sentences you to prison, they're unlikely to offer you bail on your appeal. So we had to wait 2 weeks, and then we appealed to a higher court. And yes, the higher court gave me bail. So that was really good.
And then at what point was it made clear that the police had been less than honest in the information that they had provided to the court?
It wasn't made public until the trial, but I actually knew before I was sentenced. We had that information, but we weren't allowed to put it out because I had co-accused who were still relying on that information. So we had to, wait until their trials and that sort of stuff. So
tell us about that, what that was.
Basically, the police lied and said that an ambulance had been blocked. What really happened was that somebody called for an ambulance and they did not come, and it was for us. And
right.
Yeah, so basically the police, and then used that ambulance block to keep me under house arrest as well. And so I was a danger to the community. But you know what's a danger to the community? Burning fossil fuels. So genocide is a danger to the community.
Those sorts of things, yeah. And that had actually been done quite deliberately. They had lied in order to try and bolster the case for the seriousness of your actions.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. When you start to deal with police as a protester, you realize that they actually lie quite a lot. After you're arrested, you're given what's called a statement of facts, which is what the police produce to, send to court. And I've received many of them. I've been arrested over 40 times now. I don't think I've received one yet that has actually been factual. The police are, they actually have a strategy. They call it strategic incapacitation. So the police are not supposed to be punitive. I think if you got a whole bunch of community into the room, they would agree that the police's job is to like de-escalate and then get people in front of the court. And the court's job is to be punitive. It's their job to like seek justice, right?
Yeah.
But the police, their theory is that their job is to be punitive and their job is to strategically incapacitate protesters. And so not just myself, many of us have received non-association conditions for non-violent protests. Basically we've been ripped apart, communities ripped apart. House arrest, as I said, is another one that happens. Also checking into the police station. I had to check into the police station once a week for a long time as well, which just like interrupts your whole life. And, you know, I start to develop a bit of a trauma response to police, as you can probably imagine. They're often violent in their arrests as well. And so, you know, as you can.
Yeah, with Hannah this week,
Hannah this week. And another one, I was at the Palestine rally on Sunday and I was frontline to another trans woman who she was just standing on the footpath and 6 police officers grabbed her, threw her to the ground, grabbed out this metal stick that they have and literally sat on her back and jumped on the stick as it was in her ribs. Her charge was offensive behavior.
Right. Wow.
Yeah. At a big, massive rally.
Yeah. So were there any formal consequences for the police when it was discovered that they had basically lied to the courts?
No. Long story short, no. We put in complaints all the time to police for their behavior. I recently have one back. I was assaulted by a police officer in Tasmania, and I put in a police complaint, and I got an email back 2 days ago saying, we've investigated the police officer, but he was not found at fault. And they couldn't find any evidence. All their cameras were turned off. I don't know. So, yeah, it's really hard. Police should not be investigating police. And we don't want police at our protests. We actually, you know, we as the community, we're, you know, peace protesters. We're here to protect people. We're here to save life. You know, as climate protesters, we're here to protect life. We are much more safe than the police. The police escalate all the time. That's what they do. They escalate violence, and they bring weapons. They're the ones that bring the weapons. They bring guns. They bring pepper spray. They bring chemical warfare into peace protests. You know, I was at Disrupt Land Forces here in Naarm, where they were shooting rubber bullets, you know, but these things are like this big. They hurt like nothing else, and pepper spray and flashbangs and like all of this stuff. And we were all standing there going, hands up, don't shoot, hands up, don't shoot. And they were there shooting into us with these guns, you know, non-lethal, they call them, non-lethal rounds. But if they got you in a certain spot, they would, you know, could very seriously damage you. And so we don't want the police at our protests. They're dangerous. We don't want them there. And if they are going to be there, don't bring weapons.
And it does seem this extraordinary thing that there is more focus on protests, whether it's you shutting down one lane of the Harbour Bridge, it's a rock band on the stages of Glastonbury. There's more focus on political protest than there is on the issues against which people are protesting, whether it's genocide or climate change. What do you think is going on there?
Well, it's not hard to dissect that the media is often owned by people who have shares in fossil fuel companies or in arms dealing. And so they have a vested interest in demonizing the people who are trying to shut down their deadly behavior. And so, you know, that's why your show and other independent media outlets are so important to the people to really get the message out on what's actually going on, because there's a lot of the population who just consume Murdoch media, and then they're getting the line from the corporates, they're getting the lines from the people who want to profit.
So we have seen a lot of legislative change around people's right to protest in recent years. There is a constitutional implied right for political communication, which has, as we heard, did result in some of the provisions of the New South Wales anti-protest laws being shut down, but there are still really extraordinary punitive measures. So I think in New South Wales, up to 2 years in jail and $22,000 fine. In South Australia, there were laws rushed through Parliament after a relatively modest protest had been held outside of a major oil and gas conference. Debate was for 22 minutes, and you can be fined $50,000 and jailed if you disrupt traffic for even as much as 10 minutes. Michael, what is going on with all of these laws? And are we now really seeing these kind of very critical democratic kind of actions at risk here in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, we've been drifting towards a police state really since 9/11, and that's accelerated in recent years, and it comes, it comes in waves. When something big is going on, like climate change is peaking as an issue, or at the moment Palestine, and these things, so these are the causes, and then they trigger a response, which is public protest, and then the institutional powers that object to the resistance to what's going on, the actual underlying problem, start making their noises, which they do behind the scenes, and governments respond. And we've been blessed with a long series of governments at federal and state level who do not understand democracy fundamentally, and have just been so willing to sacrifice our rights. Easy in Australia because we have not only no legally protected human rights, we also have no tradition of honouring free speech and free assembly historically. So we give up these rights very easily, and we give them up for convenience of not being disrupted on the way to work, or finding it difficult to get to the bakery, whatever. So when the New South Wales Police Minister says, "I don't think anyone should ever protest ever," nobody even says, "What the fuck are you talking about?" That just passes through, and so we just get these waves and waves and waves of repression, and at the same time, an increased militarization and empowerment of police as the instruments of that repression. And how do you expect the police are going to respond to that? I mean, they do what you'd expect them to do. They wield that power. And if you take the microcosm example of what happened to Hannah Thomas, this is a small protest at dawn, actually pre-dawn. It's like 5:30 in the morning in suburban Sydney, outside a commercial premises. There's a small group of people picketing this commercial premises peacefully, and then the cops turn up, order them all to leave the suburb and not return for 24 hours, and then they don't, and then the police get violent. Yeah. And then there's some, clearly, it's hard to tell from the video what exactly happened. There's some resistance. Whatever Hannah Thomas was doing certainly didn't justify what happened to her. I don't know how anyone could justify the degree of force that was evidently used on her to cause her that injury in that context. And I know, because I've also had a small collection of ratbag protesters in Melbourne who are constantly getting arrested, that when that gets to court, I guarantee the police did not know what powers they were exercising and did not exercise them legally.
Yeah.
But I don't really blame the cops for that. They're the one. They've been put in this position. This is what they're told their job is: stop people protesting.
Yeah.
So we're a long way down the rabbit hole.
Michael, you said, what are cops going to do when they get these extra powers and these extra budgets? And it's a very, very pertinent question. What do you think ICE is going to do with their extra $75 billion?
I think that ICE. It seems to me that the plan for ICE is that it's like they're like the SS.
Yeah.
Like they're Trump's private army,
Yeah.
and they're going to be bigger than the FBI. They are already out there with masks on and army fatigues, and they're snatching people off the street with impunity, and they have the full protection of the whole of the state, that is a lawless vigilante militia that is being built to pursue President Trump's enemies, his perceived enemies. Like that is the most terrifying thing I've seen in my lifetime.
And while we're making comparisons, just quickly, with ICE and the Gestapo, were you guys across the story about alligator Alcatraz this week?
That's what I was about to.
You can trust American capitalism to churn out merchandise for their concentration camps.
Yeah, I mean, Hannah, it did seem that with the opening of the so-called, this sort of whimsical alliterative name for the first concentration camp to be opened in the US in some time. I mean, that was a pretty terrifying sight to see kind of Trump there with DeSantis and Noam laughing as they toured what really it bears not just all the hallmarks, but is actually identical visually to the concentration camps of yore.
Yeah, and not that I think the New York Times has been doing the best reporting across these issues recently, but one of the, I think, most powerful videos I saw recently from them was saying that we're entering the stage of normalization, which is the scariest part, where he has so successfully flooded the zone consistently since he was elected that people have an inability to keep up with what he's doing. There is apathy, there's withdrawal, there's fear, paranoia, shame, shutdown. And even across the world, we're just thinking, thank God we've got the most mediocre, miserable centre-right government in history, but that's better than Trump. So the way it leads us all down the rabbit hole to believing we're fine because we're watching something happen in what feels like a parallel universe, but could be us. People are willing to kind of look away because they're too scared we aren't built to be exposed to this many things at once, but we're also not built to sit with uncertainty like this. And I think that what's really scary is that I know there are protests happening in America against Trump, but the lack, I think, of willpower and I think the lack of strength or any sort of spine from the Democrats in response realistically, besides people like Mamdani who are coming up and offering hope, we're instead just seeing Donald Trump throw, bomb after bomb quite literally, and people are so afraid of what it means for them they can't actually sort of reckon with reality that there's just going to be there's been a mass news switch off, I feel, in the last 6 months. And that's the scariest part. Instead of kind of rising up, people are just too afraid to join the conversation in any way.
Because there's sort of this week was really interesting over in the US because there's kind of two issues that were at play. There was the passing of the legislative kind of centerpiece of Trump's second term, which is basically grift, stealing more money and literally taking food out of the mouths of hungry children to entrench and make permanent the massive tax cuts for the wealthy that had been brought in temporarily with a sunset clause in his first term. Now, that is appalling. And the trillions of dollars it's going to add to the deficit really potentially destabilise the US economy for the medium term. But in some ways, that's just an extreme continuation of a lot of the economic philosophy of the Republicans. It's certainly done in a more extreme way, kicking people off healthcare, millions of people. But we kind of understand that from Republicans. But the Gestapo on the streets of major cities, people disappearing, concentration camps being opened, that does seem to me qualitatively very different from what we've seen in the States before. Hannah, would you agree with that?
Yeah, of course. But again, it's aggressive, and seeing so much of it, and seeing the actual visuals of these concentration camps, seeing actually how many people are being stuffed into them, seeing, and again, this conversation around like neighbors just like, and also again, like I have falsely sort of like failed to use like the active language of that. I've said like people are disappearing. No, people are being disappeared. People are being kidnapped and taken, and and a lot of them are just being moved offshore so that it's out of the jurisdiction. And the United States says, well, we don't have to deal with you anymore. Now you actually can't legally fight your way back in because we've removed our ability to deal with this, and it's someone else's problem now. And so I think that this is aggressive. This is an escalation, and we're only going to see it get worse. This constant weaponization, monetization. How far can he go? That's just the scariest question, and that's why so many people are afraid to even look to what the future, the next 6 to 12 months could look like, let alone the end of his term.
I mean, there's two things I think we'd want to touch on coming out of this. The second is the media, and we'll come to that because of the settlement, aka kind of payoff that Paramount did with Trump this week. But also it did seem that they're one of the very few institutions that were putting some kind of restraint on Trump and his agenda has been undermined this week, Michael, with the decision of the Supreme Court to say that the federal courts can no longer enact nationwide injunctions anymore. And so they're saying only the Supreme Court can make these decisions. So when Trump enacts or releases all of these ridiculous and, insanely unlawful executive orders, federal courts can't issue injunctions to stop them being implemented. They now have to wait until there is a case which has been brought. They can't be extrapolated out. That's probably not a great way of putting it, so you could probably couch it more succinctly in legal terms.
That's perfectly put. I think there's this really interesting battle raging in the US. The court system, the judiciary, is one of the backstops of democracy. It's the independent arm of government, and it's supposed to be a fail-safe against tyranny. And that's part of the American design, similar to ours. And the courts, at both, particularly at federal level, but also at state level, are fighting really hard against Trump. They're issuing injunctions constantly against his ridiculous executive orders. But the Supreme Court, which sits at the top of it, has been bought and sold, and is doing Trump's bidding in very disingenuous and quite appalling ways, but it has the final say, and as more cases filter up there, it's going to continue undoing the good work of the lower courts, and eventually they'll lose, they'll give up. Or they'll start being snatched off the street by ICE as well. I mean, a few already have been arrested, and that'll accelerate. And so that sort of that system, that failsafe, has been corrupted and undermined already, and it's just a matter of time before it falls, which doesn't leave much.
No.
It strikes me with what you're saying, Michael, that it's quite similar to what's happened in the media, where down the bottom of the rungs, you have a lot of independent voices doing the work, really trying to hold accountability to these tyrants. But the top level, the mass media, completely capitulated in the same way that the Supreme Court's been bought, but the lower courts are still trying. Is there something inherent in that basically the most power gets corrupted?
Well, I mean, I think with the media, it's, the mass media is not a monolith either. There's a lot of good journalists trying to do good journalism.
Of course, but we're speaking in broad terms.
Yeah, but at sort of editorial and ownership level, there isn't that level of courage, including at the public broadcaster, and so that battle, is constantly being waged. But money talks, and institutional power talks, and as institutions crumble in the face of authoritarianism, as we're seeing in the US, universities, media companies, law firms, as they make the expedient choices of giving in and surrendering their integrity, it makes it increasingly hard for anyone else to stand up, because you start to feel like, well, what's the point? I'm just going to fall under the bulldozer here.
I mean, Hannah, it was this week that Paramount, who owns CBS, capitulated. They are in the middle of attempts to merge with another media organisation, which has to be approved by the US Federal Communications Commission. So none of this is coincidental. Their crime was editing an interview that 60 Minutes had conducted with Kamala Harris during the campaign. So normal media practice, and yet that in order to pay off Trump, a major media organisation has capitulated in ways which are just undermining the very fundamental nature of a free press.
Yeah, and they didn't have to apologise. Again, they were and clearly saying, that that's separate to the merger. Of course it's not. Of course it's just trying to settle this and get it out of the media as fast as possible so they can get approval. Like, it's so obvious. But I also think, I actually wanted to come back to a point being made before about this structure and how the indies are usually the ones fighting for accountability, and it's the mass media, and that it's not a monolith. It actually reminds me again of the entire time Antoinette Lattouf has been fighting the ABC. The entire time. Every part of her body was saying, I actually want my job back at the ABC. I actually want the ABC to be great. And I think one of the saddest indictments in all of this is that there are so many, and, I've seen so many journalists who have, background from the Middle East, who have said, I want people to be reading the mainstream media because there's individual journalists in every mainstream newsroom fighting to get anything published. And even if that means watering down language, we should be celebrating that something's getting out there. I think it says something too, that even the people who are fighting hardest for accountability at the bottom levels with the least power are still so sympathetic to people trying and basic decency and something. And I think there's so much sympathy and there's so much hope in that as well, in such a kind of dark landscape and a dark Murdoch-driven time. There are a lot of good people working in these newsrooms, and I feel sorry for a lot of Australian journalists doing fantastic work in horrible places because there just are not options. I think these big decisions at the top that are completely destroying the reputation of formerly reputable sources are also doing a lot to damage the journalists who are working hard at the heart of them too.
Absolutely.
And you have seen some of the CBS journalists come out, people like Dan Rather, going, actually, what the fuck? It was the same thing when Disney, who owns ABC News, and they settled around George Stephanopoulos' description of the sexual assault that Trump had perpetrated against E.J. Carroll. And then Trump's even going after that little newspaper, the community newspaper in Iowa, that had reported on the poll, that sort of outlier poll that happened where Kamala Harris was said to be leading in a very unlikely way, in a way that turned out not to be the case, in Iowa. He is now suing that newspaper for reporting on a poll. I mean, it is trying to just shut down kind of free speech and his political opponents. It's kind of an extraordinary thing that we're going. I mean, Michael, in terms of the future of media, which we won't get into at 1 minute to 10, but
can you solve this problem for me?
I've got the answer.
But it is that incredible thing, the way that these sort of corporate interests are so wedded now in our media, and it is the behemoths who are running. Whereas there are some models that Eric Beecher had talked about in his latest book, like The Guardian have in Le Monde, where, yes, they still seem to be owned by billionaires because that's the way it is for all organisations, apart from the shot. And if you want the shot to continue, you can help us by throwing a few dollars our way to keep us the kind of independent news source that we want to be. But you can put in these sort of governance structures that ensure that they can, not only that if they wanted to, that the benign billionaires may not want to influence, but they actually cannot. Because of the governance structures that are in place, things like the foundation that owns The Guardian.
Yeah, well, another thing coming out of the US is we can observe how quickly benign billionaires can become not benign when their personal interests or commercial interests, are no longer served by a free media. And they've been collapsing like ninepins in the face of the Trump onslaught. So, we get no protection from having faith that the rich people who own the media are going to do the right thing.
Or they're even going to stick around.
That's very tenuous. I tend to agree with Eric's thesis that there is no model, that there is no sustainable economic model for media, and the only way it survives is through philanthropy or government support, and that publicly funded media is incredibly important. Ultimately, as a democracy, it just depends on what we value and what we want. And it's unfortunate that we tend to not value these things like a free press, like free speech, like freedom of movement until we start to lose them.
Yeah, and just in closing, Hannah, that is because one of the points that you have made about independent media and the sort of work that you do and indeed that we do here at The Shot is that we are still relying on the existence of institutional press because they're the ones that can afford, albeit in a fairly shaky way these days, to do the deeper dive, the deeper investigative dives on which we then kind of comment and from which we draw analysis.
Absolutely. I am piggybacking every day off the great work of Australian journalists, and I'm thankful for them. And that's why I'm so passionate about, I am very clear. I'm offering commentary. One of the scariest things that happens to me is, young people say, "You're the only place I get news." And I think, fuck no, that's so bad. I'm just a left-wing 26-year-old feminist who's going, this is what's wrong with this Murdoch headline, and here's what I think about this issue, and here's why. Like, it is not supposed to be a complicated offering. It is supposed to be a singular challenge to the Murdoch media amidst a big ecosystem of people like me who are doing great work, but are doing different work too, and disagree with me confidently and in healthy and respectful ways. And that's not supposed to be your only source of media. It's supposed to be one of your 100 things. And I think the most dangerous part of the US in politics and in media is tribal consumption. And so I think what we need to be doing is encouraging and going, collaboratively working together, which is what we're doing this morning, And a lot of, what came out of the Australian election was the need for politicians and mainstream and legacy media to engage with young people and meet them where they're at by offering better social media systems, by offering better subscription models that are more accessible. We want diverse media that actually reaches people rather than just being lots of outlets with little reach. We need to make it publicly available, and we need to make it diverse and be willing to disagree with each other again. So it goes so much further than me. But again, the work of Australian journalists is the thing that keeps me in a profitable media business, probably one of the only in Australia.
Yeah.
So I thank them very much.
Because we're not profitable here at The Shot, but we could be if you support us more. Fabulous viewers and listeners. I can't believe we've already come to the end of another show. We thank very much Michael and Hannah for joining us. Before we leave you, I'm going to ask if all of us have any top tips coming up for the week ahead or things that you have observed would like to highlight from the last few days. Michael, we'll start with you.
I'm quite excited because we're coming to the end of the 90 days deadline for the 90 trade deals that Trump has promised. And I'm just, looking forward to seeing those 90 trade deals.
Yeah, that's right. Because I think so far we've got the UK and Vietnam. So we've got another 88 to be delivered, I think, in less than 48 hours. Dave, any top tip from you?
Just total tangent. Black Sabbath played their last gig last night in the UK, and they basically invented the best genre of music. So just, respect. Shout out.
Hannah.
Slightly different note altogether. The mushroom trial has got all my friends asking me questions about the law again, which they usually find dead boring. So I think it's actually a case that's made people start talking about legal principles of criminal law in interesting ways. And I'm keen to see what the jury, if they reach an outcome in the next couple of days.
Thank you. My top tip is that Victoria's Europe Justice Commission, which was the first truth-telling commission in the country, handed down its final report this week, the result of 4 years of work, a report that names the impacts and indeed early intention of colonisation on First Nations people as a genocide, and amongst its 100 final recommendations calls for financial compensation. I'm just going to read the opening sentence of the report to close on. Written by Daniel James. We walk on stolen land, a truth etched into the soils, in the rivers that have carried stories of a people for millennia, and in the skies that have witnessed it all. Scars of colonial invasion, its massacres, violence, and relentless erasure are not confined to the past. They reside in the present, shaping the lives of First Peoples today. Colonial systems have shape-shifted but never relinquished their grip, from the first footsteps of invaders to the halls of contemporary power. The machinery of dispossession persists. Its imprint is visible in land stolen and sold, in laws that segregated and silenced, in families torn apart, and in systems that dehumanised and oppressed. And as Daniel writes in the Saturday paper this week, history cannot be changed, but futures can. So let's see what Victoria in particular, but our nation more generally, does with that report. Thank you all very much for joining us. We will be back next Sunday with the Sunday Shot. Have a good week in the interim. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.